Rapid Fire is arguably the strongest ranged core skill option in the game. While it's not inherently strong at clearing massive packs of AoE enemies, the concentrated burst of Rapid Fire is so strong. You can one-shot bosses with the right gear setups, and you'll find yourself gliding through almost any content in the game as long as you're playing the build correctly. In this video, I'm going to be covering my general purpose rapid fire build, but I'll also have a second alternate rapid fire build linked below that you can feel free to try out, which is centered around traps and generally works best for speed clearing. Before I get into the video, I do want to mention I have started my Discord server, and if you're looking for a place to ask me more questions about the builds or meet players to run content with, the link is going to be down below. But with all that out of the way, let me introduce you to the Rapid Fire Rogue. This build is a hybrid ranged build. What I mean by that is we're playing with ranged skills, but our Paragon board is specializing in close range damage. The logic for this is that we can easily build into defensives that support our close ranged attacks, and rapid fire as a skill doesn't necessarily shine from far away. If you want to see the full pathing I've taken for the skills, Paragon board, and aspects, there will be a D4 planner linked below for your convenience. The skills featured in this build are Puncture for our basic skill, because I personally believe that rapid fire is best used with combo points in the endgame, but I also understand that rapid fire doesn't need to be used with combo points because of improved rapid fire. So if you're looking for an option that doesn't use combo points, that'll be the Trapper variant that I have linked below. But we're going to keep going with my setup here with combo points, and obviously for a spender, we're using rapid fire. I find rapid fire to be a great skill for pushing endgame content and taking down bosses fast almost no matter how you spec the build. Then for our other skills, I'll start out by talking about my imbuement choices. Now, Shadow Imbuement with rapid fire in my opinion is a must. Rapid fire inherently lacks AoE damage, and Shadow Imbuement gives you some much needed clearing power with its explosive properties. Now with the next skill, you have a lot of options. You can run Poison Imbuement, Cold Imbuement, Poison Trap, Death Trap, Shadow Clone. I mean, you can run a lot of good skills. For my current iteration of the build, I'm personally using Cold Imbuement with Penitent Greaves. The logic behind Cold Imbuement is that we're getting some much needed crowd control, which synergizes well with Penitent Greaves. And the reason I'm going cold over poison is because we don't need the boss damage. With my current setup, Poison Imbuement is way overkill. I can kill level 120 to 125 bosses in no time with just Shadow Imbuement and physical skill uses, so with my current setup, I don't personally need Poison Imbuement. Then, because we're playing a build that's more focused on being close range, I'm actually running two movement skills. Those are Dash and Shadow Step. My logic for this is I can use Dash to navigate out of explosions, poison bombs, and other dangerous situations, and then I can still have Shadow Step for an Unstoppable if I get stuck in crowd control. The most beautiful thing about rapid fire with my Paragon setup, my gear, and combo points is this ability hits so hard that it doesn't require as much additive damage sources as some of the other range skills that I've shown before. But anyway, enough of my logic, let me talk about the aspects that you need to have some context for. The first one I want to talk about is a question I've been getting non-stop on my other build videos. That is Umbrous Aspect. You'll notice on the D4 planner that we're putting 3 points into Dark Shroud, but we're not using it on our skill bar. That's because Umbrous Aspect is giving us free stacks of it periodically as we're critting with marksman skills. Newsflash, rapid fire shoots 8 arrows, so you're critting really often and will have many stacks of this ability, assuming you have a decent roll. For the next aspect I want to talk about, we have Edge Masters. The logic for this is since rapid fire with improved rapid fire is giving us a ton of energy regen, we should be at near 100% energy almost all the time. So with Edge Masters, we're basically getting a flat 40% damage increase because I recommend putting it on your weapon. Now, I could talk about more of the offensive aspects, but I actually want to talk about the two most common defensive aspects that I use in all my builds. That is the aspect of Might and the aspect of Disobedience. Why these two aspects are so good is because the more active we are in a dungeon, and as long as we're using basic skills, we're stacking a lot of defensive values, which is encouraging us to stay active and keep fighting as often as possible. In my opinion, the other aspects in this build are pretty self-explanatory, but if you do have any questions, please let me know down below. Next up, let's talk about some tips and tricks for the rapid fire build. I always like to provide these because it can be helpful for understanding how to replicate some of the success that I'm finding when I'm playing these builds. For tip number 1, play close range with this build. We're taking the passive Sturdy and Siphoning Strikes, meaning we're gaining defensive value from staying close to enemies. On top of that, we have lifesteal if we're attacking close ranged enemies. To add to this, staying close is a bit easier for rapid fire because, like I said before, it doesn't have as long of a range as penetrating shot or even barrage. And no, I don't mean that literally, I'm more referring to the fact that using it from far away is less effective than how it is using it up close. For tip number 2, use Shadow Imbuement properly. Like I said before, the rapid fire core skill doesn't have great AoE compared to a lot of the other builds. To make up for this, you need to use Shadow Imbuement properly. When you're faced with a large pack of enemies, rather than just spamming rapid fire into them, you should group enemies up, build combo points, and spend them with a shadow imbued rapid fire. For tip number 3, you need to be effective when utilizing your combo points. The rapid fire ability hits so hard when amplified by combo points, and that's the trick to deleting elites and bosses in literally one shot. Now, combo points can be hard to use admittingly if you're not used to navigating packs and kiting enemies. If you're finding it difficult to consistently generate combo points, like I said before, there is a second variant of the build that I have linked below that doesn't run combo points. Keep in mind, that build doesn't have as much of a punch in it, so you'll find it less natural to push high level content with that build. Next up, let's talk gear. I always say the gear is what makes the build. You can have a perfect Paragon board and perfect skill synergy, but if your stat lines aren't amplifying the damage of the build, you're naturally going to feel weak. So let's start off by talking about the helmet. So for your helmet, there's 3 lines here that are very important. That would be dexterity, ranks of shadow imbuement, and cooldown reduction. The cooldown reduction is to make sure we have our imbuements up as often as possible. Dexterity is very nice for extra damage, and the ranks of shadow imbuement help with the scaling damage of the ability. Then for that last stat line, I'd actually prefer not having maximum energy for this build. I haven't personally found a better helmet. If you want the best stat line for your 4th stat, that would be total armor percent. Then for your chest piece, generally speaking, you want a defensive chest piece. I've said this very often in many of my videos, but your chest and your legs are 2 massive sources of defensive stats. Now, you can see here on my chest, I have a couple of offensive lines. That's because I currently have my speed set on, but if I wanted to recommend a chest for you, I would do percent total armor, percent damage reduction from close enemies, and damage reduction from distant enemies. Then for the gloves, we have attack speed, ranks in rapid fire, crit strike chance, and then that last line I would actually recommend for most of you. Lucky hit chance is going to be a great stat line. Now, sadly, I haven't found perfect gloves for this build, but for that 4th stat line where it says critical strike damage with imbued skills, ideally that would be lucky hit chance, and I'll show you why. First, I actually have swapped from running Penitent Greaves, as I chatted about earlier, to running Mangler's Aspect. If you have better lucky hit chance, this is going to be happening much more often. I find that Mangler's Aspect is very consistent with this build because of how often you're attacking, and consistently knocking down enemies is very helpful for the survivability of this build. There's also more reasons for lucky hit chance, but I don't want to make this video too long, so I won't go into them. Then for the pants, like I was talking about earlier, you can see here my pants are purely defensive. I have percent total armor, percent damage reduction, percent dodge chance, and then damage reduction from close enemies. Then for the boots, I recommend dexterity, energy cost reduction, dodge chance, and movement speed. Again, you don't need the energy cost reduction for rapid fire. You could swap that line to any sort of defensive stat line, completely up to you. Then for the bow, I have vulnerable damage, dexterity, crit strike damage with imbued skills, and basic skill damage. Now, you can guess here, I would actually like to swap my basic skill damage to core skill damage, and then the critical strike damage with imbued skills, I would swap that to a flat critical strike damage. Then for my sword, we have crit strike damage, vulnerable damage, dexterity, and basic skill damage. The only thing I would swap here is the basic skill damage into core skill damage. Then for the second weapon, I'm running Condemnation, and with unique items, you can't swap the properties, so that's what we're stuck with. But if you don't have Condemnation, you should mimic the stats on this sword to your second sword. Then if you're wondering what to do for a second aspect here, if you don't have Condemnation, you can take Rapid Aspect or Smiting Aspect. Those two are great in my opinion. Then for rings, ideally your ring will have vulnerable damage, crit strike chance, and then lucky hit chance, crit strike damage with imbued skills. Any sort of a 4th damage stat would be perfectly fine that amplifies the damage of this build. For ring number 2 here, for example, you can see here I have crit strike chance, crit strike damage, vulnerable damage, and then damage to CC'd enemies. Finally, for the amulet, amulets are always the most difficult piece here because they can have so many different beneficial things on them, and it's going to come down to what kind of content you're doing. For example, if you're pushing high-level nightmare dungeons, you're going to want a defensive amulet. But if you're speed clearing, you might just want some damage, some movement speed, some ranks into malice, some ranks into stutter step. Really, The amulet can be a lot of different things. Now for my current build, you can see here I have 2 damage stat lines and then 2 defensive stat lines. We have percent damage and 3 ranks of the exploit passive. Those are the damage lines. And then we have damage reduction from distant enemies and percent total armor. If I could have it my way, I would change that damage reduction from distant enemies into flat damage reduction. But that just about sums up the gear. Again, do keep in mind that the gear is very important to find success with this build, so pay attention to this. And if you want easy access to the stat lines, I'm also going to have them included on the D4 planner. And bam, there you have it. This rogue build, in my opinion, is the closest I've felt to rivaling Twisting Blades. I don't think this build is necessarily more powerful, but for a ranged option, there's a lot of elements of this build that outperform Twisting Blades in certain situations. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to join the Discord and consider subscribing. This is going to be my last ranged endgame rogue guide until they release balance changes or I find an extremely improved version of one of my previous builds that's worth sharing. But anyway, that's going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching. As always, my name has been valued, and I'll see you in the next one.